Thank you for that speech. We now move to the final speaker for the opposition this evening, Professor John Mearsheimer. John Mearsheimer is the R. Wendell Harrison Distinguished Service Professor of Political Science at the University of Chicago, where he has taught since 1982. He's written extensively about security issues and international politics and published 7 books, including The Tragedy of Great Power Politics and The Israel Lobby in U.S. Foreign Policy, which made the New York Times bestseller list. You have the ears of the House.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction and for being invited to be here tonight. I think there's no doubt that the United States has declined in recent years simply because we've gone from unipolarity to multipolarity. And in terms of relative power, China and Russia are much more powerful relative to the United States than they were during the unipolar moment. And I take the question on the table to be one of whether or not we should welcome further decline in America's position in the world. And what I'm going to argue here tonight is that it is not in America's interest, it is not in Britain's interest, and it is not in Europe's interest to welcome further decline in American power. Indeed, it was not in our interest to welcome any decline in American power. It would be best from America's point of view and from Europe's point of view, again, to include Britain, if we lived in a unipolar world. Now, I want to make 2 preliminary points before I lay out my argument. First of all, as Michael said in his opening comments, a lot depends on who you're asking whether or not they think American decline is good or bad. As he pointed out, from a Russian point of view, a Chinese point of view, a North Korean point of view, or an Iranian point of view, makes absolutely good sense to welcome American decline. So the argument that I'm making tonight is that from the United States' point of view, Britain's point of view, and Europe's point of view more generally, American decline is not a good thing. Furthermore, I want to make it very clear that I identify with a lot of the criticisms that have been made tonight of the United States. Mary made some of them. I disagree with Mary and my distinguished colleague on this side about the Ukraine war, as you all know. I think we've made a mess in Ukraine. I think we've made a lot of other messes. You and I both agree that what's going on in Gaza is a genocide, and the United States is complicit in that genocide. So I'm not making the argument here that the United States is a noble nation or a virtuous nation that does nothing but good around the world. There's no question that we do some good, for sure. We do some bad as well. And my argument is not one that says we want to keep the United States in the driver's seat. We want to keep it really powerful because it is a virtuous nation. As you would expect from a good realist like me, my argument has a lot more to do with power politics. So let me take the American case first, and then I'll take the European case, and again, focus on the British. Look, we live in a world where there's no higher authority. And in a world where there's no higher authority and some other state may come after you, the best way to survive is to be really powerful. As we used to say when I was a little boy on New York City playgrounds, you want to be the biggest and baddest dude on the block. And you want to be the biggest and baddest dude on the block, not because you want to be able to beat up other states or other people. You want to do that because it's the best way to survive in a system where if you get in trouble, there's no higher authority that you can turn to. So, speaking as an American, I want to make sure that the United States is and remains an especially powerful state, because that is the best way to maximize your security. If you become weak in the international system, you fall prey to other states. Just think about the Chinese. Think about the century of national humiliation from the late 1840s to the late 1940s. The Chinese were weak, and when you're weak, the other great powers prey on you. What's the lesson the Chinese take away from this? What's the reason that the Chinese are my kind of people? The Chinese understand full well they're never going to let that happen again. They want to be the dominant power in Asia, and they certainly do not want the United States to be more powerful than China is. But the fact is, I'm an American, and as an American, I want to make sure we are more powerful than China. I want to make sure we are the most powerful state on the planet. By the way, here's another example. NATO expansion into Eastern Europe. The Russians were adamantly opposed from the very beginning to NATO expansion in Eastern Europe. When Clinton made the decision in 1994, they screamed bloody murder. In 1999, when the first tranche of NATO expansion took place, they screamed bloody murder. What did we do? We shoved it down their throat. Why? They were weak. When the second tranche took place in 2004, they screamed bloody murder. What did we do? We shoved it down their throat. In April 2008 at the Bucharest NATO summit, when they said, we do not want Ukraine to become part of NATO, what did we do? We said, we don't care what you think. We're going to shove it down your throat. Why did we do that? Because they were weak. If they were powerful, there would have been no NATO expansion. And the same thing goes with the century of national humiliation. So from an American point of view, and again, I'm an American, I want to make sure the United States is the biggest and baddest dude on the block. And yes, Marriott is sometimes a bad dude, and that's unfortunate. And I've been a critic of a lot of the foolish behavior that we've pursued. But the bottom line is you have to put that aside, and you have to worry above all else about your security. And that means you want to be powerful. That's the Americans. Now, what about the Europeans? What about the British? Why do you want us to be powerful? The answer is very simple. We are committed to remaining in Europe. And as long as we're in Europe, we serve as a pacifier, Ukraine notwithstanding. But for Brits, for West Europeans, and even for East Europeans, having the American military presence in Europe matters enormously. The reason you did not have any conflict in Europe in the unipolar moment, the reason you didn't have any conflict in Western Europe during the Cold War, the reason you don't have any conflict in Europe today is because the Americans are sitting on top of you. In a very important way, the Americans are the night watchmen, and you don't want the Americans to go away. And every European politician understands that very clearly. And the problem that you face, you Europeans in the audience, including you Brits, is Uncle Sugar. You all know Uncle Sugar. Uncle Sugar has a really important threat in East Asia. And there is a powerful incentive for Sugar to pivot to East Asia to deal with China. My view has long been, what in God's name are we doing staying in Europe? There's no real threat in Europe. The Russians are a threat to stability in Europe. They're a threat to conquer Europe. Come on, this is a joke. There is a peer competitor on the planet, and it's East Asia, in East Asia, and we should be pivoting to East Asia, not hanging around in places like Europe and now getting pinned down in the Middle East. So what you Europeans want to understand is that if we get weaker, it's going to be impossible for us to stay in Europe, stay in the Middle East, and pivot to Asia in a meaningful way. We have one major crisis in East Asia, and the incentives for us to get out of Europe and move to East Asia will be very great. You don't want that to happen, and I understand full well because you understand we're the pacifier. So my bottom line is hope that the United States stays very wealthy and can keep forces in Europe, can keep forces in the Middle East, and then pivot to East Asia.
So do you believe that only Western states deserve to have security?
Do I what?
Do you believe that only Western states deserve to have security?
No, I don't. As I told you before when I started, I think from a Chinese point of view, it is in their interest for America to decline and for China to be the most powerful state on the planet. When I was in Beijing 2 weeks ago, I said constantly that if I were Xi Jinping's national security advisor, I'd tell him that we got to go to great lengths to push the Americans out beyond the first island chain, push them out beyond the second island chain, and then make sure that we, China, are the dominant force in East Asia. We are at least 10 times more powerful than Japan. We want to dominate Asia. Talking as a Chinese national security advisor, we want to dominate Asia the way the United States dominates the Western Hemisphere. It's not in China's interest, North Korea's interest, in all the cases that Michael rattled off, to see the United States be number one. But I'm speaking up here as an American and making the case for the United States, for Britain, and for Europe.
Thank you for the speech. I must say it was very refreshing to hear a defense of the United States without any morality.
I would just say to you, when I go to China, one of the reasons I'm very popular in China is that the Chinese say, finally an American who tells the truth and doesn't come over here and talk about their moral virtues.
But to my point, your and China's push makes some sense, but I have one main question. You mentioned that one of the reasons you say, that we've not had a war within Western Europe in 80 years is American presence. Some would argue it's also been the European Union which has had a strong role in that. And that leads into my second point, and my actual question, which is, do you think it is not possible to have, at some point in the future, not today, not tomorrow, but maybe in a few decades, a world order where you do not need to be the toughest, baddest guy in the block, and where we can have efficient supranational organizations that can ensure a just order?
Yeah, with regard to your second question, I think it's impossible to find a way to get into that world. We're in an iron cage where there's going to be security competition among the great powers for as far as the eye can see. And in that world, you want to make sure that the great power that you live in is the most powerful state on the planet, whether it's China or the United States. There's no way out. Your first question had to do, just quickly refresh my memory. Oh, the EU versus NATO. Yeah, I remember when the EU won a Nobel Prize. I was irate. Why did the EU win a Nobel Peace Prize for peace in Europe? It wasn't the EU that produces peace in Europe. I just got done telling you, it's NATO. It's the presence of the United States military. And the reason that the EU has been able to flourish, just one second. The reason that the EU has been able to flourish is because the presence of NATO. You take away the presence of NATO, each of these European states has to provide for its own security because sugar's not up there looking after them. And you will see that economic relations in Europe will deteriorate. And this is why I said, I believe every European politician, including Michael, fully understands that it's imperative to keep the United States here because we are the pacifier.
Okay, thank you very much for everybody that spoke this evening. Just a notice or two before we leave. There is a watch party next week running all the way through till 6 a.m. We've got extended bar license, so drink your way until the early hours of the morning watching those 10,000 voters in Wisconsin. I have to say, the floor speech prize goes to the American gentleman at the back, so see me afterwards. Winter ball tickets are on sale, but they are rapidly selling out. So if you want to get spend an evening there, do try and get your tickets sooner rather than later. But in this house, we vote with our feet. You'll see at the back the eyes, the nose, and in the middle the abstentions. So get up on your feet, walk through the door, and we'll see you in the bar afterwards for our social where we'll announce the results. Thank you, everybody.